In the last presentation, we looked at the concept of a muscle fiber or muscle cell, and then the sarcomeres that are stacked within these muscle fibers. In this presentation, we're going to look at a bigger scale of skeletal muscle, specifically how these fibers are arranged within a skeletal muscle, because that arrangement can affect their function, both in how quickly they can contract as well as how forcefully they can contract. We'll also consider some other macroscopic features of skeletal muscle. So to look more on a macroscopic level, let's take a look at the bigger picture of skeletal muscle and the different shapes they occur in. A lot of you, I know the major muscles of the body very well. And when you think of muscles like the deltoid, the biceps, the sartorius, they all are shaped differently. Well, why is that? And in most cases in biology, the reason for these differences, there is a reason, there is a purpose, there's a benefit to these different shapes. So I want to talk a little bit about muscle shapes and fiber arrangements. This picture here shows us some of the examples, and we can see terms like convergent, we can see multipennate, we can see parallel, fusiform, we can see bipennate, unipennate. Well, what do these terms mean? These terms all refer to the shape of the muscle and the angle at which the fibers are aligned with the tendon. So let's take a look at what that means. The fiber arrangements basically come in two flavors. One is either fusiform or parallel, and the other is either penniform or convergent. And let's talk about what that means. In fusiform and parallel muscle fiber arrangements, it's a muscle like the biceps or a muscle like the sartorius, where for the most part the muscle fibers are all parallel with one another, and they're parallel with the tendon that connects them to the bone. So in a fusiform muscle, we typically have a tendon that runs, again, the connective tissue runs the length of the muscle, okay? And we see an arrangement like this. The connective tissue, the fibers, the collagen fibers and elastin fibers are all going to run this direction. The muscle fibers are also going to run loosely, all parallel to the direction of pull. In a parallel muscle fiber or muscle shape, we have they are parallel. All of the fibers are like this, and we have a tendon that runs like a band from one end to the other. The muscle fibers in both of these arrangements are going to be structured in a way that they're parallel with the direction of pull. So if the muscle fiber shortens 1 inch, then the muscle itself shortens 1 inch. This type of fiber arrangement, the type of fiber arrangement that we see in fusiform and parallel muscle fibers or muscles, we are really geared towards speed of movement. They aren't our most powerful muscles, but they are our fastest muscles because, again, for every 1 inch of shortening of the muscle fiber, we get 1 inch of shortening of the muscle as a whole. So muscles like the biceps, the sartorius, the adductor longus, they are going to be this parallel or fusiform arrangement, which make them very good at developing force quickly and moving a muscle quickly. Not necessarily with a lot of force, but very fast. Penniform and convergent both exhibit a system where we have the muscle fibers come in at an angle to the tendon. So they aren't running parallel, they're coming in at an angle. Penniform actually comes from the Latin root for feather, the word for feather, and they do look feather-like. So penniform muscle fiber arrangements basically have some type of a central tendon. Let's again, I'll draw. So basically, there's kind of a central tendon that runs the length of the muscle, and then the muscle fibers will come in at an angle to that tendon. So now, if they shorten 1 inch, they don't actually move the tendon 1 inch; they move it less than that. The benefits of this type of an arrangement is that we can fit more muscle fibers in than we can in a fusiform or parallel, so we can have a more powerful muscle because we have more muscle fibers in there. However, to get that extra strength, we sacrifice speed. So these muscles are not as good at moving the body quickly, but they can move it very forcefully. A unipenniform or unipennate muscle would look like the one I just drew, where we have muscle fibers coming in from one angle into the central tendon. In a bipinnate muscle, we have fibers on two sides. And again, it does look, although I'm not the best drawer, it does start to look like a feather, doesn't it? You know, I'm impressed. I don't know if you are, but that would be a bipinnate muscle where we have the fibers coming in at two angles. Multipinnate muscles are like the deltoid, where we actually have several central tendons that kind of come together, and then the fibers come in from a bunch of angles. Like the deltoid basically has three different tendons that can, basically constitute the anterior deltoid, middle deltoid, and posterior deltoid. They come together at their inferior end into one tendon and insert into the humerus, but allows us to pack a large number of muscle fibers into a smaller area and generate a large amount of force. So peniform has this central tendon. Convergent is similar to a peniform, like a bipinnate, in that the fibers come in at an angle and converge on this central tendon. And again, the pectoralis major is an example of a convergent muscle type. But what these do is they provide, again, strength over speed, versus fusiform and parallel favor speed over strength. Generally, at each of our joints, we have a combination of these different fiber arrangement muscles. We have we have some muscles that are in that across that joint for speed and some for strength. The example in the lower extremity, we have speed muscles that would be the sartorius, the gracilis, the adductor muscles, and then we have strength muscles like the rectus femoris and so on that are going to be, again, built more for strength. So we've taken a look at the connective tissue component of the muscle. We've examined the fibers and the direction the fibers may run. Let's talk about how the muscle attaches to bone. Basically, the muscle connective tissue, the tendon or aponeurosis, or however the muscle attaches to the bone, this connective tissue of this tendon is actually going to penetrate into the periosteum around the bone. That's why sometimes people that have injuries where the tendon is under a lot of tension, Osgood-Schlatters disease is a condition in kids that when they grow very quickly, and the tendon actually is under tension all the time, and it actually starts to pull away the periosteum, which can be very painful. So the pain typically for this condition is right on the bone, and it's a tension issue. It's because the person has grown, the bones have grown so quickly, the tendon hasn't caught up, and these fibers of the connective tissue of the tendon are pulling on the periosteum and causing damage. So the muscles are going to attach typically to two bones. And they'll have a proximal attachment and a distal attachment. The proximal attachment is called the origin, and the distal is called the insertion. Now, if I know the origin and the insertion of a muscle, I can be very good at predicting what action that muscle will cause. Because again, muscles can only do one thing. They can only pull. And they basically pull in a way that is always going to pull the origin and the insertion closer together. Now, if the person is in the open kinetic chain, I can very easily predict what's going to happen. If this person is in the open kinetic chain, and I'm looking at the soleus, for instance, the soleus has an origin, up on the proximal end of the tibia. So basically up in here, and then it inserts to the calcaneus, which is the heel bone, distally. So in an open kinetic chain, I know what's going to happen is the insertion is going to be pulled towards the origin, and that will cause plantar flexion of the ankle. And again, so it's pretty easy to figure out what a muscle will do in an open kinetic chain if you know its origins and insertions. That's why I think it's so important for all of us to learn these origins and insertions, especially of the major muscles that we end up training, trying to increase the strength of in our clients and our patients. And again, it's pretty easy to predict what happens if we know these origins and insertions, which helps us analyze the motions they do and figure out what muscles are going to be involved in producing those motions. Typically, we think of the body moving in the open kinetic chain. In an open kinetic chain, like I said, the insertion moves towards the origin. However, in a closed kinetic chain, this individual here, he's doing a squat, and with a lot of weight, and he is functioning, at least his lower extremity, is functioning in a closed kinetic chain. What typically happens here is that the origins will move towards the insertion. So in a closed kinetic chain, we see the opposite type of motion occur. And that's because in a closed kinetic chain for the lower extremity, the distal end is fixed. So the proximal attachment of these bones have to, muscles have to move. The next topic I want to cover and review is the attachment of the nerves, the alpha motor neurons, to skeletal muscle. Because remember, skeletal muscle is under voluntary control. We choose to move these muscles. And now we can kind of go on autopilot when we're walking. We aren't thinking, contract my quad, contract my other quad, contract my quad, contract my other quad. You're not thinking that. But we can stop the motion at any time. And it is being initiated consciously, but then kind of being controlled by our central nervous system. So this connection between the nerve or the nervous system and the muscle tissue is going to be really important from a perspective of motor control, enhancing movement, again, training people proper technique and proper movement patterns. All involve understanding how the muscle is controlled by the nervous system. Also, we're going to take a pretty good look at force production. Again, how do we produce muscle force? How do we increase the strength that muscles have? And a lot of that has to do with neuromuscular anatomy as well. So again, if you remember back from A&P 1, whatever class you took, muscle fibers or muscle cells, again, are innervated by a neuron from the central nervous system called an alpha motor neuron. So motor means movement. So again, the name should be pretty easy to remember, but it's a motor neuron. This muscle contraction, this signal that's going to come down this alpha motor neuron actually begins in the central nervous system. Actually, in the brain is where you initiate movement, and then this movement is controlled by different parts of the cerebrum and the cerebellum. The nerves, remember, end at this structure called a synapse. So a synapse is where a nerve joins either another nerve or, in this case, a muscle fiber. In a muscle fiber, they also call this end that the nerve attaches to a motor end plate. So this would be the motor end plate. But the whole thing, the muscle fiber and the neuron that attaches to it, is called a synapse. And a synapse is where an electrical current, you can see the electrical current coming down here, okay, where an electrical current is turned into a chemical signal. So the nerve transmits impulses electrically. When that electrical signal gets to the end of the alpha motor neuron, it causes these little vesicles to burst, releasing a chemical into the space between the muscle, which is down here, and the nerve, and that those chemicals, when they're picked up by the muscle, are going to cause a contraction of the muscle. So a muscle contraction begins with a signal from the central nervous system. The alpha motor neuron releases acetylcholine, that's the little red dots, the little chemicals that we see down here, and that acetylcholine is picked up by receptors in the motor end plate, which is on the surface of the muscle fiber. The muscle fibers, when they are stimulated by this acetylcholine, will depolarize as well. We actually get a similar type of electrical current that we see in neurons pass over the cell membrane of the muscle fiber. And this is going to result in a muscle contraction. This picture shows kind of all of the different steps of how a contraction is initiated by the central nervous system. And again, just shows how the neurotransmitter is transmitted. First, an electrical signal is transmitted down the neuron. Then this neurotransmitter, acetylcholine, is released into the space between the neuron and the muscle fiber. It binds to receptors on the surface of the muscle fiber. The muscle fiber then allows sodium to rush in, which causes, again, a change in polarity of the muscle fiber cell membrane. The muscle fiber then depolarizes, or again, generates this electrical current, and then that will result in a muscle contraction. So, in conclusion, this presentation, the first of three on muscle tissue, is the purpose was to kind of go over and review the macroscopic and microscopic anatomy of a muscle fiber, and also include an examination of the connection to the nervous system. We looked at the anatomy of the sarcomere. Again, the sarcomere is the contractile unit of skeletal muscle. So that's, again, where this actual forceful shortening occurs that allows us to move and do all of the things that skeletal muscles allow us to do. We talked about the fiber arrangement and the different types of fiber arrangements found in skeletal muscle, again, including kind of a parallel arrangement or fusiform, which are good for speed. And then we saw a peniform or pennate type of arrangement, also called another type is convergent, where the fibers are kind of attached to the tendon at an angle, allows us to pack in more fibers in the same amount of area, and therefore yields a muscle that's going to be more built for strength as opposed to speed. And then finally, we did review the communication that occurs between the nervous system and the muscle fibers themselves, which allow for control of muscle contractions.